The courtroom seemed to fade away as Evan's mind raced back to their childhood, replaying countless memories of the two boys who had been inseparable. He remembered the summers they had spent exploring the neighborhood, chasing each other through backyards and darting between towering oak trees. They had been a constant source of mischief, always finding new ways to test the patience of their parents. But beneath the chaos lay a deep friendship forged through shared experiences and unwavering loyalty. Evan could still picture Marcus's infectious grin, the way his eyes would light up with excitement whenever they embarked on some new adventure. They had been partners in crime, dreaming up grand plans for the future, plans that had seemed so achievable back then, before the harsh realities of the world had a chance to shape their paths. A pang of guilt struck Evan as he realized just how much time had passed since he last saw his old friend. Life had a way of pulling people in different directions, and their once inseparable bond had slowly unraveled over the years. He had always meant to reach out, to reconnect, but the demands of his burgeoning legal career and the relentless march of time had a way of eroding even the strongest of friendships. And now here they were on opposite sides of the courtroom, with Marcus facing the very real possibility of incarceration. Evan's heart sank as he studied the man before him, searching for any remnants of the carefree boy he had once known. The weight of the years had taken its toll, etching lines of worry and despair into Marcus's features. Gone was the boundless optimism that had once defined him. In its place, a haunted gaze that spoke volumes of the trials he had endured. Evan's grip tightened on the gavel in his hand, the familiar weight of reassuring presence as he grappled with the enormity of the situation. As a judge, he was sworn to uphold the law, to serve justice without bias or prejudice, and yet the thought of passing judgment on his old friend filled him with a sense of dread that he struggled to push aside. Taking a deep breath, Evan forced himself to focus on the case at hand, to set aside the personal connection and view the proceedings through an objective lens. The prosecution's opening statements outlined the charges against Marcus: theft, fraud, and a litany of other offenses that painted a bleak picture of a life consumed by criminal activities. Evan listened intently, mentally cataloging the evidence and arguments, all the while his mind searching for any glimmer of hope, any crack in the prosecution's case that could provide a path to exoneration. As the trial progressed, Evan found himself torn between his duty as a judge and the undeniable pull of his past. During breaks in the proceedings, he would steal glances at Marcus, hoping to catch a glimpse of the person he had once known. But the man before him seemed foreign, a stranger whose actions had betrayed the very values they had once shared. Still, Evan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right, that there was more to Marcus's story than met the eye. His friend had always been fiercely protective of those he loved, driven by a sense of justice that had often landed them both in trouble. The Marcus he remembered would never have resorted to the crimes he now stood accused of, unless, of course, he had been pushed to the brink, driven by desperation and a failure of the system to provide a viable alternative. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Evan found himself wrestling with a growing unease. The evidence might have been damning, but he couldn't escape the conviction that there was more to this story, a twist that would shake the very foundations of the case. With a heavy heart, he adjourned the court, knowing that he would have to confront the demons of his past in order to uncover the truth. As Evan made his way home that evening, the weight of the day's events seemed to press down upon him. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, memories, and questions, all centered around the unexpected reunion with his old friend Marcus. The drive was usually a mindless routine, a chance for Evan to decompress and clear his head before returning to the comforts of his home. But tonight he found himself constantly glancing in the rearview mirror, as if Marcus might suddenly materialize in the back seat, demanding answers. Evan could still picture the look of utter shock and recognition that had flashed across Marcus's face when their eyes had met in the courtroom. It was a moment frozen in time, a split second when the masks of their present-day personas had slipped, revealing the ghosts of their shared past. Pulling into his driveway, Evan sat behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to make sense of it all. How had they ended up here, on such divergent paths? Where had it all gone so terribly wrong? Their childhood had been filled with dreams and aspirations, a future that had seemed full of limitless potential. They had talked about becoming lawyers, politicians, even astronauts, anything that would allow them to make their mark on the world and forge a better life for themselves. And for a time it had seemed as if those dreams were within their grasp. Evan had excelled in school, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university and then ascending the ranks of the legal system. Marcus, too, had shown great promise, his boundless energy and intelligence capturing the attention of teachers and mentors who saw the boundless potential within him. But somewhere along the way, the path had diverged, and Evan could only wonder what had happened to push Marcus down such a dark and troubled road. Had it been a single catastrophic event, or a slow erosion of hope in the face of increasingly daunting challenges? Stepping out of the car, Evan made his way to the front door, his mind still consumed by the events of the day. As he crossed the threshold, the familiar comforts of home did little to ease the turmoil within. His wife, sensing his distress, immediately wrapped him in a warm embrace, her quiet presence a soothing balm for his troubled soul. "Evan, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Evan hesitated, uncertain of how to even begin explaining the situation. How could he convey the gravity of the moment, the overwhelming emotions that had consumed him in the courtroom? It's Marcus," he finally managed, the name falling from his lips with a weight that seemed to fill the room. "My old friend, Marcus Johnson. He's the defendant in the case I'm presiding over." His wife's eyes widened in surprise, and Evan could see the wheels turning as she processed the implications of his words. She knew the history, the bond that had once existed between the two young men, and she understood the profound impact this must be having on her husband. "Oh, Evan," she said, her voice soft and sympathetic. "What are you going to do?" Evan shook his head, the uncertainty evident in his expression. I don't know. I have to remain impartial, to uphold the law. But God, it feels like I'm betraying him all over again." His wife squeezed his hand, offering a silent reassurance. "Whatever happens, Evan, you know that you've always been a man of integrity. You'll do the right thing for both of you." Evan nodded, taking a deep breath to steady his nerves. He knew she was right, that he had to set aside his personal feelings and focus on the task at hand. But as he made his way upstairs to change out of his robes, a small part of him couldn't help but wonder if the right thing was truly the easiest path to take. The next morning, Evan rose early, the weight of the previous day's events looming over him like a dark cloud. As he prepared for the day ahead, he found himself constantly glancing at the clock, willing the hands to move more slowly. Deep down, he knew he was postponing the inevitable, but the thought of returning to that courtroom and confronting Marcus once more left him feeling uneasy. When the time finally came, Evan took a deep breath and stepped into the bustling halls of the courthouse. His colleagues greeted him with their usual nods and polite smiles, unaware of the internal turmoil that threatened to consume him. Evan nodded back, mustering a thin smile as he made his way to the courtroom, his robes rustling with each purposeful stride. As he took his seat on the bench, his eyes immediately sought out Marcus, who sat at the defense table, surrounded by his legal team. Their gazes locked for a brief moment, and Evan caught a glimpse of the raw emotion etched across his old friend's face, a complex mix of fear, resignation, and a glimmer of hope that made Evan's heart ache. Turning his attention to the proceedings, Evan listened intently as the prosecution continued to present its case, laying out a damning array of evidence that painted Marcus as the mastermind of a sophisticated fraud scheme. Evan found himself scrutinizing every detail, searching for any inconsistencies or weaknesses that could provide a lifeline for his friend. But as the day wore on, the noose seemed to tighten around Marcus's neck, with each new witness and piece of documentation eroding the already tenuous defense. Evan could feel his frustration mounting, a growing sense of helplessness that threatened to undermine his composure. During a brief recess, Evan made his way to the defense table, ignoring the disapproving glances of the court staff. He needed to speak with Marcus, to try and understand how they had ended up in this situation. As he approached, Marcus looked up, his eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and trepidation. "Evan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I didn't expect to see you here." Evan nodded, pulling up a chair and settling himself in front of his old friend. "I had to come, Marcus. I had to understand what happened. How did we end up here?" Marcus averted his gaze, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the papers in front of him. "It's a long story, Evan. One I'm not sure you'd even want to hear." "Try me," Evan replied, his tone gentle but firm. "I'm here, Marcus, I'm listening." For a moment, Marcus seemed to hesitate, the weight of the years etched into the lines of his face. But then something in Evan's expression must have convinced him, because he launched into a heartbreaking recounting of the events that had led him to this point. Evan listened, his heart sinking with each new revelation. The loss of his job, the mounting bills, the temptation of easy money. It was a familiar tale of desperation, and the failure of a system that was supposed to provide a safety net. As Marcus spoke, Evan could see the ghosts of their shared past hovering just beneath the surface, the echoes of the dreams and ambitions they had once shared. When Marcus finally fell silent, Evan placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and understanding that transcended the formality of the courtroom. "I'm going to do everything I can to help you, Marcus. I promise." Marcus looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Even after all this time, Evan, you're still the best friend I ever had." Evan nodded, his own eyes burning with the weight of emotion. As he returned to his seat on the bench, he knew that he would have to navigate a delicate balance, upholding his duty as a judge while fighting to protect the man he had once called his closest friend. It was a challenge he was determined to meet, no matter the cost. As the trial resumed, Evan found himself grappling with an internal battle that threatened to consume his every waking thought. On one hand, he was bound by his oath as a judge to remain impartial and uphold the law, to set aside any personal biases or emotions that could sway his decisions. But on the other, the man sitting at the defense table was his oldest friend, the one person who had shared in the dreams and aspirations of his youth. Evan's mind raced as he listened to the prosecution's relentless assault on Marcus's character, painting him as a cold-blooded criminal who had ruthlessly exploited the vulnerabilities of unsuspecting victims. The evidence, while circumstantial, was damning, and Evan found himself struggling to reconcile the Marcus he remembered with the individual described in the case files. Yet, as the cross-examination began, a glimmer of hope emerged. Marcus's defense team skillfully chipped away at the prosecution's narrative, raising doubts about the reliability of key witnesses and the handling of critical evidence. Evan leaned forward in his seat, his eyes trained on the proceedings, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. When the day's session finally drew to a close, Evan found himself confronted by Marcus once more. This time, the raw emotion that had flickered across his friend's face had been replaced by a weary resignation, a heavy burden that seemed to weigh him down with each passing moment. "Evan," Marcus began, his voice tinged with a hint of desperation, "I know I don't have the right to ask this of you, but I need your help. I need you to believe in me, the way you always have." Evan felt his heart clench at the plea, the vulnerability evident in Marcus's every word. He wanted nothing more than to reach out and offer the reassurance his friend so desperately sought, but he knew that to do so would be to compromise the integrity of the very system he had sworn to uphold. "Marcus," Evan replied, his voice low and measured, "you know I can't allow my personal feelings to influence the outcome of this trial. As a judge, I have to remain impartial, to follow the letter of the law." Marcus nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand, Evan. I had to try. After all these years, I still couldn't bear the thought of you believing I'm some kind of criminal." Evan reached out, placing a hand on Marcus's arm, the gesture a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had once shared. "I'm going to do everything in my power to ensure that justice is served, Marcus, but you have to trust the process, no matter how difficult that may be." Marcus met Evan's gaze, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. "I do trust you, Evan. I always have." As Evan watched Marcus return to his seat, he couldn't help but feel a profound sense of guilt and responsibility. This was his friend, his childhood companion, the person who had once shared in his dreams of a better future. And now, here they were on opposite sides of the courtroom, with Evan's duty as a judge pitting him against the very person he had once cherished. Returning to the bench, Evan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges that lay ahead. He knew that the path forward would be arduous, fraught with difficult decisions and the potential for heartbreak. But as he surveyed the courtroom, his eyes settling once more on Marcus's wearied form, Evan made a silent vow. He would do everything in his power to ensure that justice was served, even if that meant confronting the demons of his own past. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but Evan was determined to navigate it with the same unwavering principles that had guided him throughout his career. He would be a beacon of impartiality, a steadfast advocate for the rule of law. And yet, deep within, a small part of him would never stop fighting for the friend he had once known, the brother he had lost. As the trial progressed, Evan found himself increasingly torn between his duty as a judge and the overwhelming desire to protect his old friend. Day after day, he listened to the prosecution's relentless assault on Marcus's character, watching as the weight of the evidence seemed to slowly crush his friend's resolve. In the quiet moments between sessions, Evan would steal glances at Marcus, searching for any glimpse of the carefree, ambitious young man he had once known. But the person sitting at the defense table was a shadow of his former self, his eyes haunted by the gravity of his predicament and the looming threat of incarceration. Evan couldn't help but question his own biases, his own preconceptions about the justice system he had dedicated his life to upholding. Had the scales of justice truly been balanced in this case? Or had the deck been stacked against Marcus from the very beginning, the victim of a system that seemed to favor the wealthy and privileged over those struggling to make ends meet? These doubts gnawed at him, eroding his confidence and forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth that the law was not always a neutral arbiter of right and wrong. It was a tool wielded by those in power, and sometimes it failed to account for the nuances of human experience. The desperation that could drive a person to make desperate choices, the systemic barriers that limited their options. As the cross-examination of Marcus's defense witnesses intensified, Evan found himself increasingly drawn into the intricacies of the case. He pored over the evidence, scrutinizing every detail, searching for any crack in the prosecution's narrative that could provide a lifeline for his friend. In the stillness of his chambers, Evan would sit in contemplation, weighing the competing interests at play. On one hand, he had a sworn duty to uphold the law and ensure that justice was served, regardless of the personal consequences, but on the other, the thought of sentencing Marcus to a lengthy prison term filled him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. What would become of his old friend, the person he had once shared dreams and aspirations with? Would the harsh realities of incarceration extinguish the last embers of the man Evan had once known, leaving behind a shell of a person broken by the very system meant to protect and rehabilitate? These questions haunted Evan, robbing him of sleep and casting a pall over his waking hours. He knew that he couldn't allow his personal feelings to influence his decisions, that to do so would be a betrayal of the principles he held dear. And yet, the more he delved into the case, the more he began to question the very foundations of the justice system he had sworn to uphold. As the trial reached its climactic stages, Evan found himself walking a tightrope, balancing the demands of the law with the dictates of his conscience. He knew that his rulings would have a profound impact, not just on the outcome of the case, but on the trajectory of Marcus's life. And with each passing day, the weight of that responsibility grew heavier, threatening to crush him under the burden of his own uncertainty. In the end, Evan knew that he would have to make a choice: to stand firm in his duty as a judge, or to risk everything in a desperate attempt to save his old friend. It was a decision that would test the very core of his being, forcing him to confront the limits of his own impartiality and the true nature of justice. As the final arguments drew to a close, Evan steeled himself for the road ahead, knowing that whatever path he chose, the consequences would be far-reaching and irrevocable. With a deep breath, he prepared to deliver his ruling, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision that would shape the course of both their lives. Just when all hope seemed lost, a glimmer of light emerged from the darkness. As the trial neared its conclusion, a new piece of evidence came to light, one that cast serious doubt on the prosecution's case against Marcus. Evan listened intently as the defense team presented the new information, their arguments bolstered by expert testimony and forensic analysis. The details were complex, but the implications were clear. The foundation upon which the charges against Marcus had been built was starting to crumble. Evan felt a surge of cautious optimism as he studied the evidence, his legal expertise and intimate knowledge of his friend's character lending him a unique perspective on the unfolding events. He could see the cracks in the prosecution's narrative, the weaknesses that had been so carefully obscured until now. With renewed determination, Evan set aside his personal feelings and immersed himself in the legal intricacies of the case. He pored over the documents, scrutinized the testimony, and meticulously dissected every argument, searching for the key that could unlock the path to Marcus's exoneration. As the defense continued to present its case, Evan found himself increasingly convinced of his friend's innocence. The prosecution's arguments, once seemingly airtight, now seemed riddled with inconsistencies and glaring omissions. Evan could almost feel the scales of justice beginning to tip in Marcus's favor, the weight of the evidence slowly but surely eroding the state's case. During the recess, Evan made his way to the defense table, his expression serious but hopeful. Marcus looked up, his eyes betraying a mixture of trepidation and cautious optimism. "Evan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what's happening? Do you really think we have a chance?" Evan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Marcus, the new evidence is compelling. It casts serious doubt on the prosecution's narrative. I believe we can win this." Marcus's eyes widened, and for the first time since the trial had begun, a glimmer of hope flickered in his gaze. "But how? How can you be so sure?" Evan leaned in, his voice low and measured. "Because I know you, Marcus. I know the kind of person you are, the values you hold dear. This isn't who you are. I refuse to believe that." Marcus's throat tightened, and Evan could see the tears welling in his eyes. "Even I don't know what to say. After all this time, after everything I've put you through, you still believe in me." Evan placed a hand on Marcus's arm, a gesture of solidarity and unwavering support. "That's what friends do, Marcus. We stick by each other, no matter what. I am going to do everything in my power to prove your innocence." As he returned to the bench, Evan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of responsibility still rested heavily on his shoulders, but now it was tempered by a glimmer of hope, a belief that justice could still be served. With a steady hand, Evan delivered his rulings, guiding the proceedings with a keen eye and a razor-sharp focus. He challenged the prosecution's arguments, dissecting the evidence and exposing the flaws in their logic. And when the time came for his own closing statement, Evan spoke with a conviction that seemed to fill the courtroom, his words cutting through the tension like a beacon of truth. As the jury retired to deliberate, Evan found himself holding his breath, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of a trial that had tested the very foundations of his principles. Whatever the outcome, Evan knew that he had done everything in his power to ensure that justice was served, for Marcus, and for the ideals he had sworn to uphold. The wait for the jury's decision was agonizing, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Evan paced back and forth in his chambers, his mind racing with a kaleidoscope of thoughts and emotions. He had laid out his case with meticulous precision, drawing on his intimate knowledge of Marcus's character and the glaring inconsistencies in the prosecution's narrative. But now the outcome rested in the hands of a group of strangers, their individual biases and life experiences shaping their interpretations of the evidence. Evan knew that he had walked a fine line throughout the trial, balancing his duty as a judge with his personal investment in the outcome. He had worked tirelessly to maintain his impartiality, to ensure that the scales of justice remained evenly balanced, and yet, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if his own desire to see Marcus exonerated had colored his perspective, if his actions had been influenced by the weight of their shared history. As the minutes ticked by, Evan found himself plagued by a growing sense of uncertainty. What if the jury saw things differently? What if, despite his best efforts, the system he had sworn to uphold ultimately failed his old friend? The thought filled him with a dread that threatened to consume him, a heaviness that seemed to press down on his chest with every passing breath. Finally, the bailiff arrived, summoning Evan back to the courtroom. With a deep breath, he straightened his robes and made his way to the bench, his eyes scanning the faces of the jurors for any hint of their decision. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence broken only by the shuffling of papers and the muted murmurs of the spectators. As the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict, Evan found himself holding his breath, his heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The words seemed to echo through the chamber, each syllable carrying the weight of a lifetime. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Johnson, not guilty on all charges." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Evan felt a surge of relief and elation wash over him, his shoulders sagging as the tension drained from his body. He risked a glance at Marcus, whose eyes were now brimming with tears of joy and disbelief. As the courtroom erupted in a flurry of activity, Evan caught Marcus's gaze, the two men locked in a silent exchange that spoke volumes. In that moment, they were no longer judge and defendant, but rather two friends who had weathered a storm that threatened to tear them apart. Evan knew that the real work was only just beginning. While Marcus had been exonerated, the scars of his ordeal would not heal overnight. He would need support, guidance, and a renewed sense of purpose to help him rebuild his life and reclaim the promise that had once burned so brightly within him. Without a moment's hesitation, Evan made his way to the defense table, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "It's over, my friend," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're free." Marcus nodded, a grateful smile spreading across his face. "I can't believe it, Evan. I don't know how to thank you." Evan shook his head, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't have to, Marcus. That's what friends are for." In the days that followed, Evan worked tirelessly to ensure that Marcus's exoneration was not merely a fleeting victory, but the first step in a journey toward redemption and reconciliation. He leveraged his connections, his influence, and his unwavering belief in his friend to open doors and secure the support Marcus would need to rebuild his life. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required Evan to navigate the complexities of the legal system while also nurturing the fragile bonds of their friendship. But as he watched Marcus take his first tentative steps toward a brighter future, Evan knew that the sacrifices had been worth it. This was not just a triumph of the law, but a testament to the power of friendship and the redemptive potential that lies within even the darkest of circumstances. As Evan watched Marcus leave the courtroom a free man, a bittersweet smile crossed his face. The years that had passed since their last encounter had taken a heavy toll, etching lines of worry and hardship into his old friend's features. And yet, despite the challenges he had faced, there was a glimmer of hope, a renewed sense of purpose that Evan found both reassuring and heartbreaking. The road ahead would not be an easy one. Marcus had been dealt a cruel hand by life, his dreams and aspirations seemingly crushed by the weight of circumstances beyond his control. But Evan was determined to be there for him, to lend his support and guidance as Marcus navigated the path to redemption and reclaimed the promise that had once burned so brightly within him. As they stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of their shared history hung in the air like a tangible presence. Evan could see the hesitation in Marcus's movements, the uncertainty that clouded his expression. After so many years, they were strangers in many ways, their lives having diverged so drastically that the bond of their childhood friendship seemed almost fragile. Evan reached out, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity and reassurance. "Where do we go from here, my friend?" he asked, his voice low and measured. Marcus let out a heavy sigh, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I wish I knew, Evan. So much has changed, so much has been lost. I don't even know where to begin." Evan nodded, understanding the depth of Marcus's trepidation. "Then let's start with the basics. You need a place to stay, a way to get back on your feet. I've already made some calls, lined up a few options for you. A job, some temporary housing, and a chance to get your life back on track." Marcus's eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of hope igniting in his expression. "You did that? For me? After all this time?" Evan offered a warm smile, his hand squeezing Marcus's shoulder reassuringly. "Of course, Marcus. You're my oldest friend, my brother. I told you I'd be here for you, and I meant it." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Evan could see the emotions playing across Marcus's face, a complex mix of gratitude, disbelief, and a lingering uncertainty that spoke volumes of the challenges he had faced. "Evan, I don't know what to say," Marcus finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything I've put you through, after the way I've let you down, you're still standing by my side." Evan shook his head, his expression earnest. You haven't let me down, Marcus. Life has a way of throwing us curveballs, of testing the limits of our strength and resilience. But through it all, our friendship has endured. That's what matters. Marcus nodded, a single tear rolling down his cheek. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Evan, but I promise I'm going to make the most of this second chance. I'm going to rebuild my life, to become the man I once dreamed of being. Evan reached out, pulling Marcus into a warm embrace, the years and the distance between them melting away in that moment. I know you will, my friend, and I'll be right here every step of the way. As they parted, Evan could see the renewed determination in Marcus's eyes, a spark that had been dimmed but never extinguished. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope could still find a way to blossom. With a nod, the two men set off, their footsteps in sync as they embarked on a new journey, one that would be paved with challenges and setbacks, but also with the promise of redemption and the unbreakable bond of a friendship that had weathered the storm. Evan knew that the road ahead would not be an easy one, but he was determined to see it through, to be the steadfast ally and guide that Marcus needed to reclaim his life and his dreams. It was a promise he had made long ago, and one that he would keep no matter the cost. For in the end, their friendship was not just a testament to the past, but a beacon of hope for the future, a reminder that even in the face of the greatest adversity, the human spirit could rise and triumph with the unwavering support of those who truly cared.